Right, I think we can get started. Good evening. Welcome to another one of Solver's Trustee and Director training events. Thank you very much for taking the time to share the evening with us and go through some common challenges that we experience in community schemes. Starting off, I think just a special word of thanks to Makapana Security Services. They are the sponsors for this evening's training. If you are in the market for security services, be sure to take a look at their website. They do offer a range of various services, mainly security services, but CCTV and offsite monitoring, technical services, tactical armed response, and more. Moving on to our guest speaker this evening, we have Zerlinda from TVDM here this evening, and she will be walking you through to this evening's topics. If you have any queries along the way, we encourage you to post them on the chat group. We'll then take that and pose that to Zerlinda during the Q&A session afterwards. So that's it from my side. I'll be handing over to Zerlinda. Zerlinda.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Firstly, thank you so much, Solver, Andre and Kuni, for the invitation to speak to your clients this evening. It's always so difficult to speak to owners in sectional title schemes because the only time they have is after hours and on the weekends. And honestly, who wants to listen to a boring old attorney talk about sectional title and HA at that time? Also, your property managers work so hard that by the time it comes to the evening, they're either inundated with all the emails that they need to catch up on, otherwise they're sitting at a meeting themselves. So thank you to the team. My experience with Solver really only started during the course of last year, and it was a fantastic opportunity for me to be involved with their property managers from a training perspective. And I can honestly say they're one of the few managing agents that really dedicate their time as a team to work on training for themselves and for their clients, which is really a great thing and to be commended. So this evening we're going to be chatting about two topics. And apparently this is hot topics amongst a lot of schemes that managing agents manage, or at least they tell me. It is about disputes, not so much disputes between owners and body corporates or homeowners associations, but disputes between the committee members, the scheme executives, as the Community Scheme Ombuds Service Act calls it. Those are the trustees of body corporates and the trustees of homeowners associations and the directors of homeowners associations as well. Now, I can tell you that some of the worst meetings I've ever been to are the meetings where the scheme executives are fighting amongst each other. One thinks that it's the general meeting where there's a difficult owner or two, but really it's the scheme executives when they're not able to agree on an issue and have a dispute that is really the cause of an issue. So that's the first thing that we're going to be chatting about this evening. The second thing is the different types of resolutions that you find in sectional title schemes and homeowners associations. I think a lot of what we're going to talk about this evening is going to be mostly focused on sectional title. And that's simply because sectional title is regulated by three different statutes: the Sectional Titles Act, so far as it is still relevant, the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act, and the Community Scheme Ombuds Service Act. When it comes to homeowners associations, it's either a common law association with a constitution, not regulated by anything else, or a homeowners association that's a non-profit company regulated by its Memorandum of Incorporation and the Companies Act. That's not really relevant to a residential homeowners association in the slightest. So that's why we tend to deal a lot more with sectional title, simply because it's a lot more regulated. So it'll be interesting to see in the chat how many of you are owners or trustees, how many of you are from sectional title or homeowners associations, and of course, how many of you are really interested in learning a little bit more about sectional title and HA. And of course, if you feel that I'm talking too much about sectional title, please feel free to ask questions related to homeowners associations. If it is a question I can answer without looking at your governance documents, I will most certainly do so. Otherwise, Andre and Kuni are more than welcome to pop those questions through to me, and I can spend a bit more time afterwards trying to assist you on those. But let's try to keep it general for now. So dealing with the first one first, the disputes in community schemes. We all know, as from the 7th of October 2016, when we wish to fight with one another, we do so through the Community Schemes Ombuds Service. And we all contribute towards the expenses of the Ombuds Service by means of a levy that is recovered from us and paid over to the CSOS every 3 months by our managing agent or whoever manages our schemes. Now, the Community Scheme Ombuds Service is not only there to deal with fights or disputes between body corporates and HAAs from a management perspective and the owners, but between the management themselves as well. Although we don't very often find these types of disputes there. It's normally an owner against another owner, or more frequently an owner against the scheme executives or the trustees. When it comes to the position of scheme executives and how to try to avoid conflict situations, it really does come down to the members, because at the end of the day, the scheme executives are elected or nominated and elected by the members. Very often we go to meetings where the meeting might run quite late into the night because nobody wants to put their hand up to be a trustee or a director. And very often it's the same group of trustees and directors that are in that management position for years and years and years because nobody else wants that thankless job. And it does become quite tough, unfortunately. And very often the scheme executives are not able to reach agreement amongst each other. So the first port of call would be for the members to ensure that they nominate and elect the correct people to be the trustees or directors of the schemes, body corporates and homeowners associations. And how do they do it? Very often homeowners associations provide in their governance documentation for a CV or something similar to be presented to the owners as part of the notice in order for the members to have a look at who those potential candidates are and to decide with enough information whether or not they'll be suitable to the scheme at hand. That very often doesn't happen in sectional title schemes simply because it's not a legal requirement. And very often the owners are voting for somebody that they don't even know, or they're voting for somebody simply because they don't want the alternative. And even worse, a vote doesn't happen because there aren't actually enough people making themselves available to fill the vacancy on a committee. That really is the worst, when the trustees aren't able to fill the number that the members so determine. That's another interesting point, is that the members should determine the number of trustees that are suitable to the scheme. We very often deal with disputes where there are just too many cooks in the kitchen. In other words, too many trustees that have been appointed for a particular scheme. I always have the opinion, and Andre and Kuni, you can shake your heads if you agree or disagree, that a scheme should have an odd number of trustees and an odd number of directors. That will ensure that the chairperson isn't placed in a situation where they have to use their casting and deliberative vote in sectional title, which is very often the case in HAAs as well. Now, bearing in mind that a body corporate's management rules can be amended, or the constitutional memorandum of incorporation can say that there must be a minimum and even a maximum number of trustees. It can even provide for the composition of that committee. For example, there must be 3 out of 5 developer representatives and 2 non-developers, or there must be the developer that's the chairperson. I'm picking on the poor developer, but that's very often the clauses that we see. We also look at the number of units in a scheme to determine what will be the correct number of trustees for that particular scheme. I like to look at between 5 to 7 trustees for most body corporates, 3 for a smaller body corporate, but you see, we stick to that odd number. And if you only have 2 trustees in a sectional title scheme, please remember that neither of them are the chairperson, because there's always going to be a deadlock of votes if they don't agree. And then, of course, the chairperson can't use that casting and deliberative vote. So firstly, in a homeowners association and a body corporate, you have to look at the constitutional memorandum and the management rules to see whether or not there is a set limitation as to the number of trustees and the composition of the trustees. If not, you as the members decide how many trustees or directors there will be, and of course, who those people are. I like to ask questions about, are you an owner? Are you a non-owner? Bearing in mind that in sectional title, all the trustees can be outsiders. They don't have to be the owners. In a homeowners association, that's very often the case as well, unless the governance documentation says that the people have to be members, which is often the case. And then, of course, one needs to look at, why are they becoming trustees or directors? Do they have a death wish, or do they simply have too much time on their hand? Are they retired executives of the big Coca-Cola type companies and aren't ready for retirement? You know, these are the types of things that you need to look at. So you need to consider, what does your scheme need? A financial trustee is, in my mind, always the most challenging position. I'm an attorney, not an accountant, which means my math skills is absolutely rock bottom, but you need to have a financial trustee, perhaps a legal trustee, or you outsource that work to people like me. And then perhaps if there's any major projects in the work, so maybe landscaping or architectural or engineering, communications might be a good portfolio as well. So you'll find out if your candidates are suitable to those positions. So that picks up on an important point, is that committees should have portfolios, dedicated portfolios. These portfolios can change from year to year. It's not compulsory unless the governance documentation provides that it should be. But that's also a good way of ensuring that disputes don't happen, is that each person sticks to their strengths and they don't interfere in each other's responsibilities. And of course, if the correct person is allocated to the correct portfolio. I don't know how many of the schemes that Andre and Kuni manage that do have portfolios, but I'm sure that they can agree that sometimes it is better to deal with one or two trustees than it is to deal with an entire committee. Of course, when it comes to decision making, and that's something that we'll chat about in a couple of minutes, the trustees or the directors do have to make decisions together as a majority, unless, of course, they've been granted the powers of making a decision relevant to their portfolio. So perhaps the landscaping trustee or the maintenance trustee can spend up to 5,000 or 10,000 Rand without getting the consent of any other trustee, or the chairperson needs to be included in all of the decisions relating to a certain amount of money. And that again is up to you as the members to direct, alternatively the trustees to delegate that. So that's something else that can ensure that disputes don't happen in sectional title or HOAs. The Community Scheme Ombuds Service Act, that is applicable to both body corporates and homeowners associations and all other types of community schemes for that matter, sets out the duties of scheme executives. And this is also something very important to look at and refresh in mind to ensure that trustees do the right thing, directors do the right thing to ensure that there are no disputes. I've got this list open in front of me, and this is going to be something that Andre and Kuni will send to all of you afterwards. I'll put some material together, or have put some material together that I'll send to you. I didn't want to send it to you before or have it open in my screen, because then you tend to read and not listen to me. So it's much better for you to rather read it afterwards and then remember what we spoke about and the examples that we used. So when it comes to duties of scheme executives, the first thing that is important is to remember that all meetings are actually compulsory for scheme executives. So you have to attend trustee meetings, you have to attend general meetings. And we very often find that on the lastminute.com, we're not available for a scheduled meeting, or that we sometimes find, these meetings talk about the same thing every single month or every single quarter. It won't hurt if we don't attend. You actually need to get the chairperson's consent to not attend a meeting, and you have to give a justifiable reason for not attending. You can write into your governance documentation that if a trustee misses without good reason, let's say 3 consecutive meetings, they will be removed automatically as a trustee or director. That's something to look at. It's very important if scheme executives meet, and of course now with Microsoft Teams and all those fun things, meetings generally happen a lot quicker, and it's much easier than to arrange an evening where everyone's available to travel, to meet, etc., etc. And of course, because you've got day jobs, you tend to do it in the evenings or on Saturdays, and nobody really wants to give up that much time for a meeting where you are voluntary, unpaid, can you imagine, unpaid assistant to the body corporate. The next thing is that a trustee or director needs to inform themselves of the governance documentation of the body corporate. So you don't rely on your managing agent. You don't say, oh, well, you know what, we don't need to know. Kuni knows our rules backwards to back to front. Of course, Kuni does know your rules back to front, but he's not responsible to enforce your rules. You as the trustees are. So you as trustees need to get a copy of the Constitution, get a copy of the Memorandum of Incorporation if you're HAs, get a copy of the management rules, get a copy of the conduct rules, get a copy of the sectional plans, get a copy of everything, and go through that documentation and make sure you understand what your function, role, responsibility is. And then, of course, the rights and the liabilities of your members as well. There is no such thing as not knowing or not being aware. I very often heard trustees say, well, we're not lawyers. How are we supposed to know what the rules say or what we're supposed to do? Something interesting is that the sectional title legislation is actually based on consumer protection legislation, which is actually very simple to understand and to read and to digest. So unfortunately, not knowing or not understanding is not an excuse. And of course, when it comes to liability of trustees and directors of homeowners associations, you can be held personally liable for any mistake that you might make. So just make sure that you know what the governance documentation of your scheme says, more importantly, where to find it. The next thing is that a scheme executive must make or take reasonable steps to get sufficient information on any item of business where a decision needs to be made. I myself can be accused of making a decision because the majority of my fellow trustees are making the same decision, or saying to the financial trustee, you know what, I don't know financials, what do you say? Should we approve these financial statements? And if the financial trustee said yes, I said, fantastic, I'll sign my name to it. You really shouldn't do that. You need to ensure that you've got sufficient information to make a decision, or you obtain the necessary assistance in order to do so. So your first port of call would be asking your managing agent, your portfolio manager, for assistance. Now, unfortunately, although they know most things, they don't know everything. So sometimes they do need to outsource this assistance, either to the auditor or to a contractor or to an attorney or whatever it might be. And then, of course, those services are available to you and should be budgeted for as well. You obviously can't incur any service if you don't have a budget for it. So that's very important. I'm of the opinion that trustees and directors, and I'm sure that Andre and Kuni will agree as well, although this training session is free and there's so many of them that are free, but you should potentially put some money aside in your budget for training. And that can be for every single new scheme executive that comes on board. It's not only going to help you as trustees to ensure that you do the right thing and don't incur personal liability, but it's going to assist your management team that work around you, including your managing agent, your fellow trustees, your complex managers, whoever you've got working with you in the management of the schemes. The other important thing to remember is that the duties and more importantly, the responsibilities of trustees and scheme directives, or directors rather, are set out in the governance documentation. So that's the first place you need to go and look. Like I mentioned in the beginning, in a homeowners association, the constitution or memorandum of incorporation; in a sectional title scheme, the management and conduct rules. It is quite possible that in your body corporate, you don't have amended management rules and conduct rules, and then the prescribed rules under the Act apply. It's obviously not going to be specific to your scheme, but pretty much most of what you need is going to be there. So we've dealt with portfolios, we've dealt with the duties of scheme executives. Something else important, and of course, determining the number of trustees, and then of course the right type of trustee or director that's going to take place, or rather be appointed at an annual general meeting or special general meeting. The next item is more often found in sectional title than it is in homeowners associations, and that is directives and restrictions to the incoming trustees. So you might have heard of it before. If you attend annual general meetings, you'll see it on the prescribed agenda list. It is giving the trustees more powers or telling them what to do, directives, and restricting their powers or telling them what not to do, restrictions. Very often restrictions are, for example, financial. You can't spend more than 50,000 Rand above any budget line item without coming back to the members or calling a special general meeting. We don't very often deal with directives, however, and when directives are raised, it's generally raised by an owner that wants something from the meeting. So they want the trustees to fire that useless managing agent, or they want the trustees to go and sue an owner, or whatever it might be. Now, when it comes to imposing directives, you can assist the trustees in ensuring that they're not going to end up in a position of dispute. So you direct them to delegate potentially some of their responsibilities to a complex manager, an estate manager, the managing agent. You direct them to appoint assistants, for example, legal representation or scrutiny architect if you're in a homeowners association or even in a body corporate, and directives to tell them to set up these portfolios that we spoke about, or direct them to amend the rules that will become more suitable to the scheme. Now, dealing with the rules, it's also a good idea to put a code of conduct into a set of rules for the trustees. In other words, how trustees meet, how they dispatch with their business, how they take decisions, that they need to disclose potential conflict of interest, that they even sign confidentiality agreements when it comes to sensitive information, bearing in mind that 99.9% of what we deal with in community schemes is part of the records of the scheme and is available for inspection and copies by any owner. That's sectional title more than it is homeowners associations. But it's a good idea in the rules to have this type of process. And of course, an internal dispute resolution clause in the rules as well. So an internal dispute resolution clause is very similar to having like a mediation clause or an arbitration clause. You don't have arbitration in sectional title schemes anymore, but you do still have them in homeowners associations. Now, when there is a fight, like I said, we go to the community scheme Ombuds Service, but the community scheme Ombuds Service requires us to prove that we've exhausted our internal remedies before approaching them. That means that we have to follow internal dispute resolution processes. And why don't the trustees have internal dispute resolution processes as well? So that's an example of something you can put into your rules to ensure that you don't have disputes. Something else that's very important is to have a strong chairperson. Now, I don't know what it is in sectional title schemes more than in homeowners associations that nobody wants to put their hand up to be a chairperson. They always appoint a professional trustee and that poor person's a chairperson. I can't tell you how many body corporates I serve on as a professional trustee where I wear the hat of a chairperson and everybody thinks I'm the queen bee because I'm the chairperson. But in fact, I've got no more power or no more responsibility than any of the other trustees. I just have to stand up at a meeting and talk, which is my favorite thing to do. And if there's a deadlock of votes, which there won't be, if you have an odd number of trustees, I have a casting and deliberative vote. The chairperson is not the one that gets into trouble every single time they use the elevator or drive in and out of the scheme. In other words, they're the ones that, get told by the owners you're doing the wrong thing or whatever it might be. That is all the trustees. I always use the example of people not wanting to be trustees because if you walk around in the local Pick and Pay, somebody is going to come and ask you something or complain about something or pull the middle finger at you or something along those lines. But unfortunately, that happens in sectional title. They seem to forget that you're an owner or resident as well. So having a strong chairperson is a very good idea to ensure that, number one, at general meetings, the order of business is maintained and people behave and they respect one another and they respect the process. And of course, the meeting ends quickly as opposed to dragging on for 3-4 hours or more. When it comes to trustee meetings, I think, in my opinion, that having a strong chairperson is even more important at the trustee decision level as opposed to general meetings, because the chairperson is the one that is going to guide, is going to motivate, is going to educate, is going to support their fellow trustees. And very often it's maybe a good idea that the chairperson doesn't have a portfolio per se, but rather assists the other trustees in their portfolios to ensure that continuity or that, like I said, that support is amongst the fellow trustees, that they all know what's going on through the chairperson. That being said, the chairperson, again, also has the authority to say to you that that is not a reasonable or justifiable excuse for not attending a meeting, that you need to be removed as a trustee. In sectional title, if you get removed as a chairperson by your fellow trustees, that doesn't remove you as a trustee. Only the members can remove you as a trustee. And of course, the members can remove a chairperson as chairperson and trustee. So for some strange reason, like I said, and I don't think it's ever going to change, the role of the chairperson is very often not one that is wanted. And just a reminder that if you're only 2 trustees, neither one of you are chairperson. I've also often been asked the question whether or not trustees could have a rotating chair. So in other words, once a month, they change chairpersons, or at every single meeting, somebody else is chairing the meeting. I don't agree that that is a good thing. There's nothing that allows or disallows it in terms of the legislation, but I do think that there needs to be, as I mentioned, continuity, especially in the leadership role in a committee with scheme executives. Delegation, it's something I mentioned earlier. The trustees, to ensure that they are all on the same page, to make sure that tasks that are awarded to them are dealt with, are done by the correct people. Trustees have the ability to delegate. They can delegate their functions, but not their responsibilities to, for example, a complex manager, an estate manager, an employee of sorts, a managing agent, a portfolio manager, And it's a good idea to ensure that the correct person with the correct skill set is dealing with the correct thing. And I know very often I get asked, what is the role of a managing agent? And I say, read the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act of all the things that trustees have to do. And most often it's all of that the managing agent has to do, except the decision making. That always rests with the trustees. Nobody other than trustees can take decisions. And of course, members, when member decisions are required. And that's something that we're going to deal with. The last thing that I can speak about is more relevant to homeowners associations in regard to disputes. And that is, and that's actually something I heard 2 days ago by a very estate manager of a very large homeowners association, your neck of the woods. He said that the trustees, or rather the directors in this particular instance, should be in a role of executives. So in other words, they're the ones that are on the board, they get reported to, but all the work and most of the decision making, so far as the governance documentation allows it to, is made by the estate manager and the estate manager's team. And you know what, it's quite true. I've been to a lot of board meetings and trustee committee member meetings in homeowners associations where the estate manager reports back, or the CEO or the CFO, whatever they're called in the homeowners associations, report to the executives, and the executives literally take 2 to 5 minutes to make a decision, as opposed to very often in a sectional title scheme where the trustees speak and speak and speak and speak about the same topic for hours and hours without coming to a decision. Or even worse, at the next meeting, talking about it all over again and then changing their decision. So perhaps it is a good idea to look at delegation to an executive of sorts, even if that is somebody that is outsourced, for example, an employee, or like I mentioned, a professional trustee, which you can do in sectional title and which you can do in your HAA if your governance documentation provides for it. So that's pretty much all I can think of that can assist you in your community schemes when it comes to dispute resolution. I've got one question on my side that is a direct message that I'm going to send to you, Andre, and then perhaps we can leave it for a little bit later and you can post it to me there. And then, Kuni, you've mentioned as well, if other trustees find out that a fellow trustee is dishonest, what can they do? All right. So dishonesty goes with conflict of interest, I think, as well. And Andre, I see I copied the wrong thing to you. I'll send it to you now. When it comes to conflict of interest, it is very important, especially in a sectional title perspective, where the Act actually dictates that you as the trustee are removed completely from any discussion, any decision-making surrounding a matter where you have a direct or an indirect interest. So in other words, where there's smoke, there's fire, move away from it completely. If you have to start questioning whether or not you have an interest in a matter, in all likelihood, you have an interest in that matter and you need to recuse yourself. And very often that affects the number of trustees. And that's also a very important point to keep at the back of your mind when you look at who the nominees are for trustees and directors and who you vote for. Because if you're going to vote for, let's say, husband, wife, daughter in the same family and 2 others, you are potentially going to place the body corporate in a situation where 3 out of the 5 trustees can't exercise a vote because they're all going to have exactly the same interest. Another example to look at is, for example, if you have a developer as a trustee, or if you have a contractor to the body corporate as a trustee, you need to remember that that person is going to have to recuse themselves and potentially affect the quorum of trustee or director meetings. When it comes to conflict of interest in recusing yourself, you need to look at the governance documentation of your homeowners association as to what that says, but most often it's pretty similar to sectional title. When it comes to dishonesty, you know, there's a difference between dishonesty and fraud, but at the end of the day, you can be held personally liable for both. So if the trustees or the directors do find out that a fellow trustee is being dishonest, of course, it needs to relate to the administration and management of the scheme. They can't say, hey, we went to Durban for the weekend and it turns out that they stayed at home. I mean, that's got nothing to do with the body corporate. It says a bit about the person, but it doesn't really say much about the body corporate. If they're being dishonest in regard to the administration and management of the scheme, it's most certainly a concern. And if that person is the chairperson, the only thing that the fellow trustees can do is remove them and that they're only a trustee, but they can refer the matter to the members, and the members can be requested to remove the trustee. You, of course, as a trustee in that type of situation, would much rather prefer to have the opportunity of resigning as opposed to being asked to leave by your fellow members. Nobody wants to be in that situation where they attend a meeting and they're being removed as a trustee. But if you are going to find out that there's a situation where a trustee has been dishonest, especially because trustees, in the very word or the name, is in a position of trust, a fiduciary duty, a statutory duty to the community scheme, and you deal with trust funds, monies of other people, investments of other people, if there's an element of dishonesty, that person must really rather be removed, or at least the conduct needs to be brought to the attention of the members. Andre or Kuni, is there anything that you'd like me to add, or anything that you'd like raised at this point before I go on to the resolutions?
There are a few questions coming through on the group. I think maybe let's address them under the, well, put it this way, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to address them now or move on to the next topic?
Either or, really don't mind. Maybe while they're fresh in people's minds, we can deal with it.
Okay, all right. So then starting with the first question, it was, the trustees feel tired after some time, can they nominate to have caretakers for the complex? That's if no other person puts up their hand to be a trustee. So can a caretaker then step into that role if someone resigns?
All right, so we dealt with the whole delegation issue. Now, in sectional title, you cannot be a trustee if you are an employee, the managing agent, or an employee of the managing agent, unless you are also an owner in that scheme. You also need to remember that if you are going to make such a person a trustee, they're going to be wearing multiple hats, and at some point in time, they're going to have a conflict of interest, and they're going to need to be recused from any discussions or decisions relating to them. So the caretaker, for example, can be an employee of the body corporates and can be an owner and can be a trustee, but because they're employed by the body corporate, at some point in time, their salary and potentially their bonus needs to be discussed. So they shouldn't be the financial trustee, or if they are the financial trustee, when it comes to that item relating to them, they need to be completely removed from it. You can, as opposed to making such a person a trustee or director, delegate a particular trustee or director's role to them. That being said, if somebody is going to resign from the committee, the number that was determined by the members are going to drop, or the number is determined by the governance documentation is going to drop. If there is no limitation on the number of trustees or directive as to the number of trustees, the trustees are not forced to fill that vacancy, provided they're still above the minimum quorum requirements. So it is possible to not appoint a replacement trustee for somebody that has resigned or for a vacancy, but rather to delegate those functions to a person like a caretaker.
Perfect, thank you. Then the next question, interesting one, puts that trustee into a difficult position. But if other trustees find out that a fellow trustee is dishonest, what can they do?
So that was the one that we spoke about a couple of seconds ago, that I also, I suppose, confused everybody with the whole conflict of interest issue as well. But with the dishonesty, you need to look at whether or not that dishonesty has a material impact on the scheme, the administration and maintenance of the scheme. So if they were dishonest with regards to a contract potentially that they were going to enter into with the body corporate, that they said, and this is an actual matter that I dealt with, a body corporate was approached by a big service provider, a cell phone service provider, and they wanted to put up one of these towers or pylons or whatever you call them on the common property. And 3 of the trustees of the 5 were pushing for this to happen. And it turns out upon further investigation that those 3 trustees were actually shareholders, and one was actually employed by this company. And they didn't tell their fellow trustees, and they didn't tell their fellow owners. That would be dishonest, because it would have had a material impact on the outcome of entering into a contract like that. So that type of information needs to be provided to the owners, and a decision needs to be taken on it, and potentially the removal of the trustee as well. There's a provision in the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act that says that if there is such a material conflict of interest or a conduct on the part of a trustee that is not necessarily in line with their statutory duties or fiduciary duties, there can be almost, what would you call it, recused from that position, or it could be seen as being okay if all of the owners agree to them continuing in that role. But to get all the owners to agree to something is an impossibility, even if there's only 2 of them.
Yeah. Okay, good. And then this question was raised during the time that you were saying that how specifically the Sectional Titles Act was written in a understandable sort of format. So the question was twofold. One, where do they get that documentation from? And the second part of the question is this particular person was under the impression that the body corporate, and the same would apply for homeowners association, have insurance against personal liability for duties that they carry out for the body corporate. So the first part of it I can certainly assist with by saying on the Solver website for everybody present that is residing in sectional title developments, we do have the Sectional Titles Act and all the regulations attached to that as well. So they can certainly get it from there. But Zerlinda, perhaps you can carry that, answer that for us.
Okay, fantastic. So on our website as well, you're more than welcome to get the information. And you need to remember, in a sectional title scheme, it's the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act, the Sectional Titles Act, and the Community Schemes Ombuds Service Act. So those are very important pieces of legislation to remember. The second question, just remind me where that came in. The
second one was really around the insurance for the trustees carrying out their duties.
Perfect. So I think whenever it comes to insurance and financials, my memory automatically puts a block on it because I'm not the expert. And I know that you work very closely with Mike Addison from AdShow when it comes to insurance. And he's actually recently done a webinar for us that's available on our website as well, actually on this very topic of fidelity insurance. So under the Community Scheme Ombuds Service Act, the regulations to it, there is a statutory requirement that every single community scheme, homeowners association, sectional title, you name it, has fidelity insurance in place. And fidelity insurance is for the naughty trustees, the naughty employees, or the naughty managing agent that runs off with your money and decides to buy a Ferrari or Porsche, whatever it might be, which has been known to happen. Now, when it comes to insurance, like any insurance, you obviously have to look at the T's and C's and the small print, and very often these types of conduct is actually not an insurable event. So you have to also exhaust all of your remedies. You have to institute civil action and all that fun stuff before you can go the route of the insurance. So you can't only rely on that, which means you can't say, oh, well, we're going to appoint any trustee left, right, and center, and if they do something bad, we have insurance. It doesn't work like that. Although you have that cover, you also need to make sure that your scheme is properly managed and administered. So yes, it's a statutory requirement to have fidelity insurance. The fidelity insurance also needs to basically cover your operating funds at a particular point in time. So the more money you have in the bank, the more cover you need to actually protect that money. And that's a moving goalpost, which is why approval of insurance, including fidelity cover, is a prescribed line item on your agenda for your annual general meetings.
Okay. There looks like 3 more questions on this particular topic. Can a board of trustees have no chairman? We actually get the question quite often where they say, you know what, they don't want a chairperson. Yeah. They're all very active and they're all kind of, so yes, if you could proceed with that.
Perfect. It's like they copycat each other. They always have the same answer. You know, we all do everything. You know, none of us really want to take on that responsibility. But you do have to have a chairperson. The only time you don't have a chairperson is when there's only 2 of you. This is for sectional title. For homeowners associations, the governance documents could say something else, but it's unlikely. I've never seen a constitutional memorandum that does not provide for a chairperson.
Okay, good. Then dealing with the trustee, and this is quite common as well, where you have a board of trustees and not everyone is participating. And the ones that are participating are getting frustrated by the ones that are just part of the board, but they are, because they are neglecting their duties and they're not attending the meetings, it makes those quorums difficult. It creates complications because now all of a sudden they're not participating. How do you deal with that?
So that's, one of the things I said right in the beginning is to make sure that the number of trustees that you determine is going to be the right number for your scheme, that it's not going to place the body corporates or the homeowners association in a situation where quorum is going to be a problem. And it's also why we have that duty of scheme executives in terms of the Community Scheme Ombud Service Act that says that trustees or directors have to attend their meetings. And if they don't, their excuse for not attending it has to be justifiable and reasonable and accepted by the chairperson. Under the sectional title legislation, the amendments and the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act, it is possible for a trustee meeting in a body corporate to continue even if there's not a quorum. So decisions can be made, they're called interim resolutions, and then after the meeting, they have to be approved in writing by the trustees. So it is possible in sectional title for the business of a meeting, a trustee meeting, to still continue without a quorum. But in a homeowners association, I sound like a stuck record. It depends on the constitution and the memorandum of incorporation. But very often, management of a body corporate is put on the back burner, and the day-to-day affairs is not something that you can take care of because people simply are not available. They don't respond. It's also an amendment to the legislation, the sectional title legislation, that you can set a deadline for responses to written resolutions. So when it comes to trustee resolutions, if the managing agent needs you to agree to something or to decide on something, they can say you must respond by Friday at 2 o'clock. And if you haven't responded by Friday at 2 o'clock, you've deemed to have consented and you fall away from the calculation of that vote. Obviously, they can't act if nobody responds, but it is quite possible for decisions still to be taken if there is trustees that don't participate. I recently engaged the managing agent that said they never hear from their 2 trustees because neither of them have email. Now, I can't imagine such a world of not having email. I would love to live in a world of no email because life would be a lot slower and more enjoyable, but it's unlikely and quite impossible, impractical to be a trustee if you don't have email communication or if you're not able to be communicated with. Things don't work on a snail's pace. Your managing agent can't put, a letter in the post and wait for Postnet or postal system or whatever to deliver it. They need things to happen quite quickly. And very often you send an email, and before the email is even in your inbox, you're on the telephone telling the person to look at their inbox to find the email that you've just sent. That's how quickly things happen in sectional title and HA.
Okay. Then another question that came through, is there a max term of service for a trustee, or more specifically in this case, for a homeowners association, for a director to stand as a director?
So the management rules in a body corporate for a trustee would need to be amended to provide for that, because the prescribed management rules in the Act don't. When it comes to a homeowners association, I do more often than not see that there is a term of office that is allowed under the governance documentation. It's normally, perhaps 2 to 3 years in a consecutive cycle. I have dealt with many community schemes where the trustees have been trustees for many, many years. In one of the schemes that I work with quite closely, the chairperson has just celebrated his 90th birthday, and I think 30 odd years of those 90 years, he's been the chairperson of the scheme. But if the homeowners association more particularly has a limitation on the number of terms that can be served, it will be in the constitution or the memorandum of incorporation.
Okay. And then once a trustee or once the trustees and or the managing agent has proof that a trustee has been dishonest. So in this particular case where a trustee was refused remuneration from the owners in an annual general meeting, and they then opted to contact service providers to get a percentage of the work done and all kinds of things. And when there's proof that that's actually happened, what would you recommend the trustees or the managing agent do in those sort of situations?
Okay, so it sounds like investigation has been done, and it sounds like the evidence is there that there has been dishonesty. That most certainly must be taken to the members, because remember, a trustee can't be removed by their fellow trustees. Only the role of chairperson can be vacated by the remainder of the trustees without actually removing the trustee. So that information needs to be presented to the members, and the decision needs to be taken by the members for the removal of that trustee. And if the body corporate has suffered a financial loss, or that trustee has had a financial gain, that trustee can be held personally liable for that financial loss. Oopsie, Siri's talking to me over here. And that personal liability is set out in the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act, and one would again need to look at the constitutional memorandum of the HA if there's something similar there. Alternatively, a matter can be, or a case can be opened at the Community Scheme Ombuds Service to deal with that trustee's conduct, or, as one of the questions were posed earlier, a claim can be made against the fidelity insurance of the body corporate or the homeowners association as well.
Okay. I'm going to, I see there's another 5 messages that have come in. So what I'm going to do is just go through 2 of them. Those that I don't get to, we'll either pose them in the Q&A session later, or we'll answer them separately and directly to the unit owners tomorrow. But another question that came through was verbal abuse. We've seen it of late as well, where trustees are, they don't like decisions that are passed, and they get quite aggressive, and they on WhatsApp, and now WhatsApp is the easy thing to do, and they start swearing, and they start getting quite aggressive and abusive towards one or more of the other trustees. And it was put quite nice on here. Do the trustees blixen them, or do they have a chat with the body corporate about it? So I think you did cover it slightly earlier, but if you could just expand on that again.
I'm all for the baseball bat to blossom them if the opportunity comes, but people are so litigious that, you know, somebody does the wrong thing to you, you don't turn the other cheek, and you're the one that gets into trouble at the end of the day. So it is better to turn the other cheek, as one would say. And, you know, I would most certainly refer it to the members. You know, the worst thing in sectional title and in HA, in my opinion, is WhatsApp groups. Now, in the Homeowners Association where I live, and yes, I live in a community scheme, I must be crazy, but I do. And we've got 2 WhatsApp groups. We've got one for chit chat, and we've got one for security. And the chit chat one, I will literally put my phone down, and an hour later, there'll be like 274 unread messages. And sometimes it's quite useful, and other times it's not. And the members seem to control themselves or each other when things get a little bit political or a little bit rude or whatever it might be. But there is no privacy on such a WhatsApp chat, and things can get out of control quite quickly. And we very often had instances where somebody complains about somebody's barking dog, and before you know it, the SPCA is out, and then somebody's threatening to sue the other person, and all sorts of fun things. So a WhatsApp group is not necessarily the right place to deal with communication of the body corporates. What I would recommend from a communication perspective, and you must always keep the communication channels open in a body corporate or an HA, and very often owners' biggest complaint is that there's no communication or no transparency. So communication is a good thing. But when it comes to these social media platforms, if you can call WhatsApp social media, would be to have it perhaps only like for announcements. So the trustees, or a trustee, or the managing agent, or a building manager, whatever it might be, is the administrator, and you simply post messages on there for announcement purposes. So the water is going to be shut off tomorrow for 24 hours, or we are having renovations undertaken in unit 204. Please make sure that you keep your windows closed, or the window cleaners are coming out next week Friday, whatever it might be, as opposed to having, you know, a formal WhatsApp group. If the owners are going to create a WhatsApp group amongst themselves, then by all means they can do it, but I don't believe it's a good idea for the community scheme to have an official channel of communication through a WhatsApp group. You can have, you know, like a lot of these software providers have all sorts of interesting platforms and portals for the members to go on, to get records, to speak to one another, to speak to yourselves as managing agent or the trustees. That's potentially a better route to go on. When it comes to trustees disrespecting each other, you know, like I said, the worst meeting I've ever been to is the one where the trustees fight with each other, and the members have to try to pull them back into order. Some of the things we spoke about earlier should be able to help that solution. But if trustees aren't able to work together, or there is a trustee that is not treating their fellow trustees respectfully, the best thing that they can do is have that trustee removed by the members. When it comes to members speaking rudely or disrespectfully to owners, it happens very often. And I mentioned earlier that they seem to forget that the trustee is unpaid and that they are probably their fellow members. I've had a personal experience with an owner in a scheme where I lived, and I was the chairperson, where I was so, I don't want to say fearful of the owner, but so not wanting to deal with the owner, that when I saw them driving past my garage one day when I arrived home, I quickly closed my garage door, locking myself into my garage to avoid that owner. Not a moment that I'm very proud about, but the lengths that you will take to avoid somebody. Maybe take the stairs as opposed to the lift when you see somebody that you don't like. So it's better to avoid those types of confrontation issues. But if you can't, again, the internal dispute resolution processes that you have or should have in your rules is something to look at, or to simply, unfortunately, push that type of correspondence onto the managing agent. And when I was a managing agent, my employer always used to tell me, we are paid to wear the bulletproof vest. And when the bulletproof vest wears thin, you simply go and purchase another bulletproof vest. In other words, you put your management fee up to deal with those types of owners. But as trustees, you don't need to communicate directly with owners, most certainly not. As managing agents, you also don't need to take that type of abuse at all. And an owner that is speaking that way, or a trustee that is speaking that way, most certainly does not have the I suppose the best interests of the community at heart, and should be treated similarly. But the conflict situations that arise from that, it's better to rather use the formal channels, the internal dispute resolution, the CSOS, all those fun things, as opposed to taking the baseball bat.
And that is a common trend that we're seeing lately as well, where these WhatsApp groups that was opened up with good intention, there's just owners that are finding fault and just wanting to use those WhatsApp groups not for its intended purpose. And the trend that we're seeing is they are changing that either into a broadcasting group or actually closing that down, because it's actually working against the complex. So then, the second last question here: what are the legal ramifications of not having a chairman?
A slap on the wrist. There is no real legal ramifications. I suppose an application could be made at the Community Scheme Ombuds Service that you don't have one. But as I said, the chairperson has no more powers or responsibilities, and the role of chairperson can be outsourced from a chairing a meeting perspective. So there aren't any legal ramifications, no.
Okay, and then the last question that I think would be interesting for all owners is, if there's no trustees or no participating trustees or no directors or no participating directors, that's something common as well. And we've had it as well at annual general meetings where nobody wishes to stand because they see the politics involved, and now everyone's turned off it. What happens where there is nobody willing to stand as a trustee?
I've been to a meeting where I made everyone stay until they elected at least 2 trustees. The meeting did go on until past 11 o'clock at night, and it started at like 5:30, however, and one of the trustees resigned promptly an hour after it closed. So that's an option, but not the best option. When it comes to not being able to get trustees or directors to stand, there's a couple of different options, of which none of them are really positive for the community scheme because it involves costs or negative implication. So the worst case scenario is that the scheme is placed under administration. And now nobody wants to buy in or live in a scheme that is placed under administration. It's a very bad connotation, and the value of your properties will drop exponentially. The administrator is court appointed, and the administrator not only takes the decisions of trustees, but they take the decision of the owners as well, which means you as owners have no say legally in your community scheme. So definitely not the way that you want to go. The alternative, which does cost some money, is the appointment of an executive managing agent that can work with your existing managing agents, but take the role of trustee. So in other words, you don't have trustees or directors. Well, this is rather for sectional title. So you don't have trustees, you have an executive managing agent. The concept of an executive managing agent is a sectional title concept, but it can be written into the governance documents of your homeowners associations. The alternative to that would be the appointment of a or more professional trustees, which again has a cost associated with it. In a sectional title scheme, if a professional trustee is a non-owner, it simply needs budget approval. In a homeowners association, again, it depends on what the governance documentation says as to whether or not such a person can be appointed. But you're going to be in a position where the body corporate is going to suffer financially. I don't think there's one body corporate that really wants to budget for legal fees or that want to budget for external management for a position that should be dealt with or managed by owner residents or tenants or occupiers or somebody with a vested interest in the scheme. But those are the alternatives.
Perfect. Okay, so there's still more questions coming through. I'm going to try to the best of my ability to answer that while we move on to the next topic. And then if there is time, we can address it under the Q&A session later. Yeah, so if you could continue on your end.
Fantastic. So I thought that was the more interesting of the two topics. The second one is very legal, and this is where the boring part comes in. So if your tummies are rumbling and you want to go grab something for dinner, I really won't blame you at all. But when it comes to resolutions in community schemes, again, I'm going to focus more on sectional title because the legislation sets out specifically what these resolutions are. There are different types of resolutions in homeowners associations. I'm going to give one or two examples in each instance. But the training material that I'm going to send through to Andre and Kuni afterwards is literally going to have a list of every single resolution that you find in sectional title along with every single example. So it's going to be like a little handbook or Bible that you can use going forward. So from the lowest level of resolution to the highest level of resolution in a sectional title scheme, we start off with a trustee resolution. A trustee resolution is a majority trustee resolution. It can be taken at a meeting or it can be taken in round robin, in other words, in writing. If a trustee is not within the Republic of South Africa, they're excluded from a round robin resolution. When it comes to a round robin resolution or a meeting or a resolution taken at a meeting, they both need to be recorded in writing, in other words, as part of an actual document resolution or the minutes of a meeting, and it needs a majority of the trustees to approve. Not the majority of all the trustees, if at a meeting, but rather the majority of a quorum, if a quorum is met. If it's in writing, it's a majority of all of the trustees. Any trustee that has an interest in a matter, like we mentioned, cannot be part of those discussions or part of that decision making. An example of a trustee resolution is, for example, the decision as to whether or not an applicant owner can undertake renovations or alterations, or can keep a pet within a scheme. So that's just two pretty straightforward examples of trustee resolutions in body corporates. The next level of resolution is an ordinary resolution, and the trustees can refer any of their decisions that can be taken by a trustee resolution to the members by ordinary resolution. Ordinary resolutions are simple majority of members at a meeting. Now, interestingly, an ordinary resolution cannot be taken by a round robin, in other words, in writing. There is no provision for it in the Act, which means if you are not going to table an ordinary resolution at a meeting and you're going to attempt to do it in writing, you need the written consent of every single owner, which is even more than a unanimous resolution. So it's not very often that happens. An ordinary resolution, like I mentioned, simple majority, is calculated only on participation quota, not in number. That's for special and unanimous resolutions, which I'll mention now. An example, or rather examples of ordinary resolutions, are pretty much every single decision that is tabled at an annual general meeting. Approval of the number of trustees or determination of the number of trustees, election of the trustees, restrictions and directions, budget approval, appointment of the auditor. That is all ordinary resolutions. The next level of resolution is a special resolution. Very often people say, surely a special levy needs a special resolution, but just because it has the word special in it does not mean it needs a special resolution. To actually raise a special levy only needs a trustee resolution. So there's another example of a trustee resolution. A special resolution is one that is taken by the members as well. Calculated 75% both in number, in other words, one member, one vote, and in participation quota, in other words, value. And that is 75% of a quorum at a meeting. And then if it's done via round robin or in writing, it is 75% of all of the owners. An example of a special resolution is the amendment of conduct rules or an extension of a section. Those are both special resolution examples. The fourth level of resolution in a sectional title scheme is a unanimous resolution. And unlike the dictionary definition of the word unanimous, a unanimous resolution is a resolution that is passed by 100% of the owners at a meeting, forming an 80% quorum. So it's not a unanimous resolution of all the members of the body corporate, but a unanimous resolution of an 80% quorum. Now, when a decision is taken via round robin that needs a unanimous resolution or in writing, then it is 100% of 100% of the owners. In other words, everybody. I very often get asked the question about, if we go to a meeting and we have, let's say, 85% quorum, if the person that makes up that 5% is the person that is going to vote no against the unanimous resolution, will the unanimous resolution still pass because we still have 80%? So in other words, 85 minus the 5%. Unfortunately not. You need 100% of that entire quorum, provided the minimum quorum is 80%. Now, Andrea and Kuni, you can agree or disagree, but in my experience, it is almost impossible to get a quorum for unanimous resolution. And a unanimous resolution is needed for very few items in terms of the legislation. Management rule amendments are an example, which is why most body corporates do not have amended management rules, because it's just too darn difficult to get a quorum, an 80% quorum. Most often I find in the meetings that I attend, and unfortunately with remote attendance meeting, it hasn't gotten any better, unfortunately, and in some instances it's actually worse. A quorum generally floats around what, late 30s, early 40s percentage, which is really not that great. And the bigger the scheme, the more difficult it is to actually achieve a quorum as well. Now, when it comes to special and unanimous resolutions, I mentioned that it needs to be passed both in value and in number. Number, one member, one vote. When you're dealing with a member, however, one member could own multiple sections, but that member still only has one vote in number. If the various sections owned by that member is owned in different entities, then it would be different members with different votes. So that often complicates matters as well. So that is trustee resolutions, ordinary resolutions, special resolutions, unanimous resolutions. Now, there are two other levels of consent. The next one is the written consent of all owners. This is different to a unanimous resolution, and I very often struggle to explain this to people, because a unanimous resolution taken in writing is also the written consent of all owners. There's only one thing that comes to mind when it comes to the written consent of all owners, and that's a change of use. So for example, if you've got a balcony as part of your section and suddenly you want to have an additional bedroom and you want to convert that balcony to a bedroom, that would be a change of use. So that's not normal renovations and alterations that need trustee resolution. That's actually something that needs the written consent of all owners. And because we've just mentioned that it's generally unlikely that all owners attend a meeting, this is the level of resolution that is not taken at a meeting. It is literally something you get door to door or email to email, the written consent of all owners. The last type of decision is one that requires bondholders' consent. And an example of that would be an extension of a section where the proposed extension will result in a deviation of the participation quotes of a section of more than 10%. The written consent of a bondholder is needed. That being said, if a notice is sent to a bondholder and they don't respond within 30 days, their written consent is deemed to have been obtained. I've never been to a meeting where a bondholder has shown any type of interest. And generally speaking, when you deal with bondholders, you're dealing with home loans at ABSA. So the notice goes to info at ABSA, for example. So there's not really a person per se associated with that. So that's the different levels of resolutions in sectional title. When it comes to homeowners associations, I most often find board resolutions or trustee resolutions, which is very similar to sectional title, again with the conflict of interest situation and the majority decision. And then you find what the Constitution and the memorandum very often just refer to as resolutions, but that would be member resolutions or ordinary resolutions. And then you have special resolutions. There are only two instances I've ever seen in a constitutional memorandum, and I'd be interested to see if there are any other examples, or Andrea Kuni, if you have any other examples, where in a homeowners association, a special resolution is required for the amendment of the governance document, so the Constitution or the memorandum, and then for the purchase or acquisition of of items. So example, an electric fence or an upgrade, or for the alienation of a portion of the common property or the sale of a portion of the common property. Those are the only two examples that I have of special resolutions. So in an HOA, you'd have board resolutions or trustee resolutions, ordinary member resolutions, and special resolutions. Generally, you don't have requirements of bondholder consent, you don't have requirements of written consent of all owners, and I've never seen a requirement of a unanimous resolution. That's more sectional title concepts. So those are the levels of resolutions in sectional title and HOA. I'd be more than happy to take any questions on those, but it would rather be quite boring if I had to give you an example literally as per the Act, but that information will come through to you in the next couple of days.
Great, thank you very much. Let me see if there's any queries specifically relating to the dispute. This gentleman is a trustee living outside of South Africa. Are there any restrictions in terms of decisions that need to be made or when documents need to be signed?
So interestingly, as I mentioned, when a written resolution is needed, so in other words, no meeting happens, the trustee that is outside of the Republic of South Africa is excluded from that. I don't like to apply that because no matter where you are in the world, there generally is internet and of course, emails and all the fun stuff that goes with it. So my advice would be to always include all trustees irrespective of where they are. Now, if you are sitting outside of the country, and for example, you can't attend physical meetings. If there are physical meetings, it doesn't mean that you can't be a trustee, but it is possible for an alternate trustee to be appointed in your absence. That alternate trustee will not be an additional trustee if you're available, but will rather be your replacement when you're not. So that's an option to look at. And you can have one alternate trustee appointed for any of the trustees, or you can have multiple alternate trustees appointed for obviously all of the trustees as they go. And that alternate trustee has the same level of responsibility as other trustees and also continue to hold office until such time as the AGM. That is a sectional title concept again, though.
Perfect, thank you. I think that sums up all of our, oh wait, there's one more. All decisions be done through resolutions, for example, the change of balcony, or can it be done via email or special general meeting?
So we touched on the relevant resolutions that are trustee decisions or board resolutions versus member decisions. And you can take member decisions in round robin or in writing or at a meeting. Generally speaking, it's easier to do it at a meeting because of a lower quorum requirement for those resolutions. When it comes to trustee decisions, however, all trustee decisions must be recorded in writing. And the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act actually sets out when there actually needs to be a trustee resolution. So, for example, the imposition of interest, the raising of levy increases, approaching the community scheme ombud service, investing money into a bank account, signing a contract, those all need actual resolutions, not just minutes. That's not sufficient.
Yeah, and we have the question often for sometimes these type of resolutions or change of conduct rules, can it not be done over round robin resolution with the owners? And I'm first to say, it's going to be very difficult to get 75% of the owners to actually sign something saying they're in favor of a change or not. So like you pointed out, I'm more in favor of saying let's have a quick meeting with the owners, be it online. Nowadays most of the meetings are online and people are preferring it, and we have it online and we get that resolution passed, and it's easier. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely, I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Okay, good. Are decisions by WhatsApp acceptable for trustee decisions, or should they be followed up with an email? And I think this is the whole Electronics Communications Act that comes into play here. We've had a lot of questions of late since COVID. Everything's being signed electronically, and I know over email the attorneys have advised us that in terms of the Electronics Communication Act, that over email it's 100% legal and legitimate and so forth. But what about over WhatsApp?
So I don't like WhatsApp as being a form of communication on a formal matter. So in other words, a decision matter. I do think the trustees, if they have like a little WhatsApp group amongst them, can discuss issues, but a decision should be recorded in writing, or at least be reduced to writing. I know that you could potentially, copy the text off a WhatsApp and then put it in an email, but then you might as well just put it in an email to start off with. Any decision needs to come from a source that is also identifiable. So provided you can identify, the telephone number as being one of the trustees, or the email address as being one of the trustees, I believe that a decision that is recorded on WhatsApp is legal, but it is not preferable. We very often go to meetings where an owner will come to you and say, oh, so-and-so can't attend the meeting. Can I please show you their WhatsApp that they're appointing me as the proxy? The Act speaks about a prescribed proxy form that you obviously can't have on a WhatsApp unless you filled it in, taken a photo of and showed you via WhatsApp, which you might as well just forward via email. But the prescribed form doesn't actually have to be used. The information in the prescribed form needs to be used. But you as the portfolio manager on the evening at the meeting needs to be able to determine that that number is actually associated with that owner. And I don't know about you, but if you had to take every single telephone number, every single email address, every single contact information of every single one of your owners to a meeting, you'd have files and files for days. So it's unlikely at the meeting that you'll be able to confirm that that is in fact the owner. When it comes to remote attendance, the Act actually says that the chairperson of the meeting must be able to reasonably identify the attendees as well. And I think it starts becoming a bit challenging via WhatsApp. So if possible, stick to the email. If possible, stick to the prescribed forms, but it's not impossible. An ex-managing agent colleague of mine is on every single WhatsApp of every single one of the 50-odd buildings that he manages. And he says that sometimes they forget that he's on the WhatsApp with the stuff that they talk about, like, oh, that managing agent again, whatever, and he has a good old laugh. But what very often happens is that he'll go to bed with all of his messages read. During the course of the night, there's a flurry of activities, and the next morning he gets told, why haven't you done X, Y, and Z? And he says, where's the email? Where's the instruction? And it's come through on, a WhatsApp thread of 100-odd messages. And that's not reasonable to expect your portfolio manager to have a look at that, or even expect your fellow trustees to be kept up to date with discussions like that are happening. So I try to steer clear of that.
I support your views there 100%. So two things. When it's over email, you can search for it. There's that paper trail. It's almost as tangible. It's there. Whereas WhatsApp, to go back and find that decision, it sometimes becomes tricky when changing phones or upgrading phones, and it is a bit of a risk. And then the second thing that you touched on is the WhatsApp groups. And I certainly, we have these morning collaboration meetings with the staff. And it's a common thing where a portfolio manager gets asked to join some of these groups. And I've had it before where I've been part of a group and I go into a trustee meeting, and when I come out, I've got 80 messages. And I know I shouldn't be doing it, but I'm getting into my car and I'm scrolling through it and I'm trying to bring myself up to speed. And my biggest fear is there's one line within there that says, Andre, do this. And I miss out on that. And that's where the risk comes in, because you've got so many messages and people are just commenting on everything, that there's that risk that something gets missed. So I certainly encourage all the trustees to, if there is a decision that's passed, just say that there was a resolution passed on the WhatsApp group where everybody CC'd in, and please can you get this action, or whatever the case may be. And I find that's a lot more effective.
Definitely.
Okay, then last question before we end up, and I'm going to ask, please, for those of you that's still part of the meeting, don't leave. There is a draw, that's 2 draws that we're going to be doing for some gifts for attending. So last question before we do that. Maybe he says that maybe not related. I think it is related. They said, what happens in a homeowners association where there is no MOI, or a memorandum of incorporation, or no conduct rules for that matter? How does the complex proceed, and what happens while that's being finalized?
Okay, so prior to the amendment of the Companies Act in 2008, you would have had articles of association under the 1976 Companies Act. all articles of association needed to be amended or converted to a memorandum of incorporation. That being said, there was both a prescribed articles of association in terms of the Old Companies Act, and there's a prescribed memorandum of incorporation under the Companies Act of 2008. But both of those documents, very similar to prescribed management and conduct rules under the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act, is not going to be specific to your HAA. So it's not like you won't have a memorandum of incorporation. You simply won't have one that is relevant to your homeowners association. Estate rules or conduct rules, very often homeowners associations don't have it. In a homeowners association that is a non-profit company, there's two different types of rules. There's rules that are put in place by the directors, and there's rules that are put in place by the members. And very often those are simply your, as the name says, conduct issues, and called estate rules or board rules. Most often it is a set of rules that is only amended by the directors, and other times supporting documentation like architectural guidelines will be something that is amended by the members. But no sectional title scheme or no homeowners association will be unmanaged or ungoverned. In other words, not having documentation. Will always have documentation, but it won't be specific to the community unless it has been amended and put in place.
Good. Thank you very much. All right. So with no further questions, Zerlinda, I just wanted to say thank you again very much for attending this evening and for sharing your invitation. Yeah, for sharing your knowledge with us. I'll be handing over to Leah, who generally does our poll for or what do we call it? Polls. Yeah. So Leah, are you there? There we go. She does our draws for us. That's the word that I was looking for.
Sorry, who was the question directed to?
Leah, sorry. Okay, there she is with everything. Good evening, Leah.
Evening, ladies and gents. Thanks, Andre. So we have two prizes. One is a lovely hamper from Solva, which is fantastic. And then the second prize is from TVMD, which is sponsored, and it's a 2,000 Rand hamper. So that's also great, or a voucher, sorry, a voucher. And I've got all the names of the attendees in this little jar, and I'll do the little draw quickly. I've got a drum roll. They're ready for you guys. Okay, and it is Biolanda Blackie. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes, well done. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, and then we go on to the second draw for the 2,000 Rand gift voucher. Okay, and I'm pulling the draw. Let's see who won that prize. And it's Denise Salisbury.
Good, well done. All right, excellent. So then tomorrow we'll get in touch with the winners. Thank you very much. And for everyone that took the time to join us this evening, thank you. And we hope to see you at our next training session, or more than likely be early 2022, believe it or not. We're there already. Good. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening all.